I never imagined a simple family dinner could expose every truth I had tried to ignore for years. It was the kind of night that forced me to finally see my place in this family for what it truly was. My name is Meredith, and I was sitting at the same table where I had poured my time, my effort, and my savings, including the $59,000 they begged me to use to save the restaurant. Dad set his fork down and delivered the sentence that cut through the room with stunning precision, a sentence he spoke only days after using my money to pull their business out of collapse. No one needs your money, or you anymore. The air did not shift. Mom kept eating as if the words were nothing. My sister lifted her glass with a satisfied look, claiming the restaurant's recovery as her personal victory, while acting as if my sacrifice had never happened. I kept my posture steady even though a heat tightened across my chest. Their certainty told me they believed the power had fully shifted in their favor, yet they had no idea how long I had been preparing for this exact moment. I watched them rewrite the truth, take credit for what they never built, and dismiss everything I had carried, and I understood that staying silent would be the sharpest choice I could make. My silence that night was not surrender. It was the beginning, and by sunrise they would finally learn who truly needed whom. If you want to hear how everything unraveled after that dinner, and why those words ended up costing them far more than they expected, stay with me until the end, because this story speaks for anyone who has ever been pushed aside by the people they fought hardest to help. A call from Mom came late in the afternoon, and the tension in her voice made my stomach tighten before she even explained what was happening. I drove to the BBQ restaurant owned by my parents and walked into a space that had once been filled with noise and confidence, yet now felt drained of its identity. The chairs were stacked unevenly, the lights dimmer than usual, and the fatigue etched on my parents' faces told me the truth before any paperwork did. Dad sat behind the counter with piles of overdue invoices spread across the surface. He pushed a stack of documents toward me, and I scanned the numbers that showed how dangerously close the restaurant was to shutting down. His tone carried a weight I rarely heard. "You are our last hope." The sentence pressed on me harder than the columns of debt ever could. I asked Mom whether my sister Erin could help in any way, hoping she might share part of the responsibility. Mom shook her head and insisted that Erin was dealing with her own issues. Erin appeared a moment later, still in her pajamas, and asked Mom what she planned to cook for dinner without even acknowledging the growing crisis. Mom comforted Erin and looked at me with an expectation that left no room for refusal. I needed space to think, so I met my best friend Calvin at a quiet cafe near our old school. Calvin listened to every detail while trying to keep his expression neutral, though I could sense his concern. He reminded me of all the times I had stepped in for my family without receiving much recognition. Calvin said I should consider how this decision might drain me again, and he asked whether I wanted to repeat the same cycle. His words were reasonable, yet a part of me still believed that helping now might finally shift how my parents saw me. That evening, I returned to the restaurant. Dad handed me additional bills, each one reflecting the same urgent story. Mom stood beside him with a mix of desperation and relief, as if my presence alone signaled a solution. Erin walked by again and commented on how exhausting her day had been, even though she had not contributed to anything related to the business. Mom brushed her hair gently and whispered something reassuring before turning to me with hopeful eyes. My parents watched me closely as I read through the last document. The truth was plain to see. The restaurant would not survive without immediate intervention. I took a slow breath and agreed to help. I told them I would cover the debt, which totaled $59,000, but I wanted a written financial agreement to ensure transparency. Mom nodded with almost frantic eagerness, and Dad said it was unnecessary, but agreed anyway, mostly because he knew they had no alternative. I read the contract twice before signing, making sure the clause I added would protect me if things went wrong. I did not reveal the details of that clause, and they did not ask. My parents were too relieved to question why I insisted on a formal document. To them, the crisis seemed to fade the moment I picked up the pen. They thanked me repeatedly with emotions that felt more like desperation than gratitude. As I left the restaurant with the agreement in my bag, I felt a cautious sense of hope. I believed that stepping in might finally show my place in the family, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to imagine that this sacrifice would change something meaningful. Yet even then, a quiet unease lingered beneath the surface, hinting that the future would not unfold the way I hoped. A few weeks after the debt was cleared, the restaurant moved with a pace that reminded me why people in this town loved our food during better years. I arrived before sunrise to handle the first deliveries, and I often stayed until the last receipt printed because every system had to be rebuilt after months of neglect. I managed the kitchen rotation, the scheduling, the overtime approvals, the vendor calls, the weekly transfers, and the constant stream of customer feedback, which came faster than I expected once the smell of steady business spread around the neighborhood again. The pressure exhausted me on some days, yet there was a strange clarity in seeing the place breathe rather than choke under unpaid bills. The momentum grew even stronger by the second week, when lines stretched through the doorway during lunch hours. Mom handled the register with an energy I had not seen in months, although she occasionally glanced toward Aaron, who began showing up at unpredictable times. Erin walked through the kitchen with a clipboard she never wrote on, and she lingered beside conversations she had never been part of when the restaurant struggled. Her presence tilted the air in a way that forced me to step aside, so she would not accuse me of shutting her out. She smiled at customers as if she had worked during the difficult stretch, then followed me into the office without being invited to observe my progress on payroll. Mom and Dad praised Erin whenever customers complimented the food or the service. They talked about her dedication, her leadership instincts, and her vision for the menu, even though she had not offered a single suggestion when the bank threatened foreclosure. I listened without interrupting because my energy needed to stay focused on keeping the system stable instead of correcting their version of history. Erin nodded at every compliment as if it confirmed something she had believed about herself for years, while I typed quietly to avoid providing a reaction that could be twisted into resentment. I noticed subtle changes inside the office during the following days. Meetings that used to include me suddenly happened behind the closed door of the storage room. Vendors called to confirm decisions I had not heard about. The weekly budget sheets were revised by someone else, then placed on my desk without explanation. The pattern repeated enough times for me to understand it was not a mistake. Erin was becoming the center of their planning, even though she had no experience handling the financial rebuild. Her confidence grew with every whisper they shared away from me, and she began correcting my decisions in front of newer employees who had joined after the crisis ended. Dad dismissed my questions when I tried to clarify the changes, telling me he trusted Erin's fresh perspective. The phrase settled in my mind with an uneasy weight because it echoed the shift I felt in every corner of the restaurant. I adjusted my approach by creating distance wherever possible, which allowed me to observe without inviting conflict. The distance protected my focus, and it also revealed how eager Erin had become to mirror authority she never earned. She monitored small tasks that once belonged to my daily routine, then reported her observations to Mom with a quiet confidence that suggested she expected Mom to agree with her assessments. During this time, I kept working in a quiet rhythm that preserved the stability of the place, while avoiding direct arguments. I tracked every change carefully and documented each shift in responsibility, not to confront anyone immediately, but to understand how far they planned to push me out. The constant reassignments showed a version of the truth I had tried to ignore when the debt crisis first began. I realized I had to protect myself long before the final blow arrived at the dinner table, because the warning signs were already here, woven into every decision they made without me. By the end of that month, I sensed a shift forming before anyone said a word, although I tried to stay focused on the operations that still needed attention. The restaurant felt different in a way that suggested decisions had been made without consulting me, yet I waited for my parents to speak, rather than assume what direction they intended to take. Their announcement arrived during a quiet moment in the office, when Mom folded her arms with an expression that almost resembled sympathy. She said Aaron would start managing the place for a while because they did not want me to exhaust myself after everything I had done. Dad supported her with a nod, adding that Aaron possessed a natural leadership style the business could benefit from as it entered a stronger phase. The words landed with a dull heaviness, not because I feared being replaced, but because their tone hinted at a conclusion they had already reached behind closed doors. Erin entered the office a few seconds later with a bright confidence that revealed she knew about the decision long before I heard it. She explained her plan for a new operating model that included extended shifts, revised scheduling protocols, and a menu adjustment she believed would modernize the restaurant. Her voice carried a rehearsed certainty that made the proposal sound like a performance she had been waiting to deliver. I listened carefully to identify the practical gaps, yet Erin interpreted my silence as an invitation to take control with greater enthusiasm. Employees soon approached me with concerns that Erin pushed them beyond reasonable limits, especially when she required longer prep cycles without considering the physical strain on the kitchen staff. Several described moments when Erin corrected them abruptly in front of customers, which created tension that spread through the team faster than I expected. I continued observing quietly because responding defensively would only provide Erin with a reason to portray me as resistant to improvement. Erin escalated her involvement by reviewing sections of the financial log she had barely glanced at during the crisis, then inserting notes that contradicted the legitimate records I had maintained for months. The situation grew heavier when I realized she had modified certain entries instead of verifying them. The changes were subtle enough to appear like clerical corrections, yet precise enough to shift responsibility for specific high-cost orders away from decisions she recently made and toward earlier dates. I studied her adjustments in silence because confronting her prematurely would only make her assume authority she had not earned. She noticed me reviewing the ledger one afternoon and delivered a soft remark that carried more bite than volume. Erin said she needed everything organized properly now that she was stepping into a formal role. Her eyes lingered on me long enough to imply that she believed the numbers should reflect her version of order rather than the truth recorded during the rebuild. Mom praised Erin later that day, telling a server that the restaurant finally had real direction under Erin's guidance. Dad echoed the sentiment with a comment about Erin's steady instincts, which left an aftertaste more revealing than they intended. Their approval grew louder as the week continued, while my contributions faded from their conversations as if they belonged to a distant chapter. I continued working with an even rhythm that allowed me to track the changes without revealing how closely I was monitoring each shift in authority. Erin walked with a heightened confidence that bordered on entitlement, and the staff began treating me carefully because they sensed the power balance shifting in ways they did not fully understand. During a quiet night in the office after the dinner rush, I retrieved the financial agreement I had signed at the beginning of the crisis. The paper felt heavier than I remembered as I unfolded it to review the clause I had included for my protection. The clause did not solve everything yet. It reminded me that I had prepared for the possibility that gratitude would fade once stability returned. I read it slowly, realizing I might need to act sooner than I planned because the signs of decline were already taking shape in Erin's decisions and in my parents' eagerness to let her reshape everything they had allowed me to rebuild. Then came that dinner, the one where everyone acted as if the past weeks had been perfectly ordinary. Mom arranged the dishes with forced cheerfulness, while Dad leaned back in his seat with a calmness that suggested everything in his world was finally under control. Erin sat across from me with her usual confident posture, swirling her wine like she was celebrating a victory only she understood. The room carried a strange brightness, as though the tension sitting between us had been neatly folded and tucked under the table. I took my seat, and immediately sensed that something rehearsed was about to unfold. Mom asked a few casual questions about operations at the restaurant, questions she already knew the answers to because she had discussed them with Aaron long before this dinner. I was no longer invited to those conversations, and everyone at the table seemed comfortable pretending that fact no longer mattered. Erin began listing what she called this month's accomplishments, though the only thing I heard was the erasure of my work. She went through every improvement I had made since the debt was cleared, presenting each step as her own idea, her own initiative, her own talent. She spoke with a confidence she had never possessed before the day I paid $59,000 to save the restaurant from shutting down. Mom nodded at every point Erin made. Dad added approving comments about Erin's natural leadership, offering them with the tone of someone announcing a promotion. I watched their faces with a strange sense of detachment, as if I was seeing them from outside my own life. Erin glanced at me with a smile sharp enough to cut through the air, a silent acknowledgement that she had stepped into a position she believed now belonged entirely to her. The charade could have stretched on longer, but Dad decided the evening needed a conclusion. He placed his glass on the table with deliberate precision, looked directly at me, and spoke the sentence that would sever the last thread holding us together. "No one needs your money, or you anymore." The words settled heavily into the room. Mom didn't blink. Erin didn't flinch. They reacted as if this declaration had been planned and agreed upon long before I walked in the door. Erin leaned forward slightly, her voice smooth. "The restaurant is thriving because of me, not you." Her confidence was absolute. Mom didn't object. Dad didn't correct her. They accepted the rewritten version of reality without hesitation, a version where I didn't exist in the story of their recovery. I looked at Erin for a long moment, then at Mom and Dad. None of them met my gaze with an ounce of recognition for what I had done. They didn't mention the sacrifices. They didn't mention the long nights. They didn't mention the money that kept their doors open. It was as if my contribution had been wiped clean from their memories. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. Hard experience had taught me that arguing in this family only made the truth disappear faster. Silence revealed more than any confrontation could. In that silence, I read every motive, every shift in loyalty, every hidden agreement that they assumed I was too blind to see. Dinner carried on around me, but I withdrew from the rhythm of their conversation. I watched the way Erin described future plans for her restaurant. I watched the way Mom indulged it. I watched the way Dad supported it. And I realized the betrayal had been completed long before this dinner. When the meal finally ended, I stood up slowly, feeling a resolve I had never known before. If they no longer needed me, they were about to learn what that truly meant. I would take action that very night. The next morning, I woke up with a strange clarity, as if every emotion from the night before had settled just enough to make room for an irreversible decision. I left the house earlier than usual and drove to the bank with the mindset of someone who no longer owed anything to people, who had dismissed every contribution I ever made. The atmosphere in the lobby carried just the right amount of seriousness to keep me steady for what I was about to do. At the consultation desk, I met the financial advisor who had helped me draft the investment terms back when I paid off the restaurant's debts. His role was always to assess risk and ensure every one of my financial decisions followed proper compliance. He recognized me the moment I said my name and asked which clause I intended to activate. The way he looked at me made it clear he knew this wasn't a routine visit. I told him to officially stop all automatic payments flowing from my account into the restaurant's system. There was no hesitation. A few confirmations later, the cash flow returned to its rightful owner, me. He informed me that the recurring transactions had been locked, and any future payments would have to come directly from whoever was legally running the restaurant. Then I requested the cancellation of all supplier credit lines I had set up to stabilize their inventory during the recovery phase. It meant vendors would no longer rely on my account for invoice clearance. Every order would now have to go